In 1962, a man trapped 120 feet underwater made the decision to end human history. He was sitting in a metal tube, completely blind to the outside world, suffocating in 140-degree heat. He hadn't slept in 3 days. The carbon dioxide levels in the cabin were so high that men were hallucinating in the dark before their bodies simply gave out, hitting the steel floor in dead faints. Then, the ocean itself started trying to crush them. It began with a deafening metallic shriek. A shockwave slammed into the hull with so much kinetic force that the submarine was violently thrown off its axis. Rust and dust rained from the ceiling. The emergency lights shattered, plunging the 80 suffocating men into absolute darkness. Then came another explosion, and another. They were being hunted. Something above them on the surface was dropping high explosives directly onto their heads, trying to crack their hull like an egg. The captain of the submarine, Valentin Savitsky, dragged himself upward in the sweltering, blood-red emergency light. His brain was starved of oxygen, his body shutting down from heat stroke. He screamed for the communications officer to contact Moscow, to get orders, to beg for help. The radio officer listened to the static, his face pale. Nothing. The airwaves were completely dead. Moscow wasn't answering. No one was answering. Captain Savitsky put the pieces together. The relentless, lethal bombardment from above. The absolute radio silence from his homeland. There was only one logical, terrifying conclusion. Moscow was gone. His family was gone. World War III had already begun, and they were the last Russians left alive. "We're going to blast them now," Savitsky screamed, the panic and rage finally breaking his mind. "We will die, but we will sink them all." He turned to his weapons officer and ordered him to arm the special weapon. Deep in the bow of the submarine, exhausted men wrestled a massive, heavy cylinder into the launch tube. It wasn't a normal explosive. It was a T-5, a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo, a miniature sun. To launch it, the firing circuits required the physical keys of the 2 highest-ranking officers on board. The political officer, absolutely convinced they were in the middle of a nuclear holocaust, did not hesitate. He inserted his key. Captain Savitsky inserted his. The locking mechanisms clicked into place. The firing sequence was primed. All they had to do was push the button, and the world, as you know it, would cease to exist. If you want to know how fragile your reality is, let me tell you exactly what happens next if that button is pushed. The T-5 torpedo leaves the submarine at 45 knots. Within 60 seconds, it detonates against the hull of the American aircraft carrier directly above them. The explosion is so violent, it instantly vaporizes millions of gallons of seawater. A blinding dome of underwater nuclear fire atomizes the carrier and the 3,000 men aboard before their brains can even register the flash. The surrounding destroyers are flipped like toys, crushed by a shockwave that cracks the ocean floor. 15 minutes later, the Pentagon receives a fragmented, frantic transmission from a surviving ship at the edge of the blast radius. Nuclear strike. President John F. Kennedy doesn't have a choice. The rules of engagement are already locked in stone. An unprovoked nuclear attack on an American fleet demands immediate retaliation. DEFCON 2 instantly snaps to DEFCON 1. Within 45 minutes, American Jupiter missiles stationed in Turkey ignite, tearing into the sky toward the Soviet Union. Simultaneously, Soviet commanders stationed in Cuba see the launch flares on their radar. Assuming the American invasion has begun, they fire their tactical nuclear warheads directly into Florida and the American South. 2 hours later, the heavy intercontinental ballistic missiles fly. If you are standing in New York, London, Berlin, or Moscow, you don't hear sirens. You don't have time to run. You just see a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns, and then your shadow is permanently burned into the concrete behind you. Over 100 million human beings are erased from the Earth in a single afternoon. But the initial blast is a mercy compared to what comes next. The firestorms from hundreds of burning cities suck the oxygen out of the atmosphere, pumping millions of tons of black, radioactive soot into the stratosphere. Within weeks, the sun is entirely blocked out. Global temperatures plummet. The The oceans freeze at the shorelines. This is nuclear winter. Global agriculture collapses overnight. In this timeline, the internet is never invented. Modern medicine stops in 1962. The billions of survivors who weren't instantly incinerated are left to blindly wander a freezing, sunless wasteland, fighting to the death over canned food and clean water, slowly suffocating on radioactive ash. Humanity goes extinct, not with a whimper, but choking in the dark. And all of this, the death of everything you have ever known or loved, was locked in. The torpedo was in the tube. The 2 keys were turned, but the launch sequence failed. It failed because of a bureaucratic anomaly. The submarine, B-59, was the flagship of its flotilla. That meant there was a 3rd man of supreme rank on board. The flotilla commander, a 36-year-old officer named Vasili Arkhipov. By protocol, because Arkhipov was present, a nuclear launch required 3 keys, not 2. Captain Savitsky and the political officer turned to Arkhipov in the boiling, screaming dark. They demanded his key. They demanded their revenge. Another explosion rocked the hull. The ship violently groaned, inching closer to structural failure. Every evolutionary instinct in the human brain screams at a cornered, dying animal to bite back. But Arkhipov didn't turn his key. He refused. A vicious, desperate psychological war erupted in the sweltering control room. It lasted for 10 agonizing minutes. Savitsky berated him, calling him a traitor, screaming that it was their duty to avenge their dying country. The pressure in that room was enough to crack diamonds. Imagine standing face to face with a commanding officer whose mind is completely breaking, while the ocean explodes around you, demanding you to help him pull the trigger. Arkhipov anchored himself in pure, icy logic. He looked at the frantic captain and realized something the others hadn't. He refused to hand over his key. Instead, he talked. He didn't pull rank. He slowly, methodically, dismantled the captain's delusions. He pointed to the ceiling. He pointed out the rhythm of the explosions. He fought a war of empathy and reason against a man consumed by the apocalypse. Slowly, the panic in the room began to fracture. The logic pierced through the toxic air. Savitsky stared at the firing panel, his chest heaving. The fire in his eyes finally burned out, replaced by total exhaustion. He backed away from the keys. He ordered the submarine to blow its ballast tanks and surface. The men prepared to die. They knew what was waiting for them above. They were surfacing directly into the middle of World War III, surrounded by the enemy fleet that had been trying to slaughter them. The submarine broke the surface. The heavy steel hatch was thrown open. The starving crew poured out, gasping for the cool, sweet ocean air. They squinted into the darkness, bracing for the gunfire, bracing for the sky to be choked with smoke and fire. But the sky wasn't on fire. It was full of stars. They looked across the calm water. The American destroyers were there, but their guns were silent. Instead, they had their searchlights turned on, illuminating the submarine in the night. The Americans weren't attacking them. The depth charges that had been crushing their hull, shattering their lights, and driving them to the absolute brink of madness. They weren't lethal weapons. They were practice rounds, training explosives. The Americans had been dropping them as a warning, an underwater knock on the door, trying to signal the submarine to come up for air. They never intended to sink them. The dead radio wasn't because Moscow was destroyed. It was just because they were too deep underwater to receive a signal. There was no war. The entire apocalypse was an illusion, born in the dark, fueled by heat and fear. Vasili Arkhipov never received a medal. When he returned to Russia, his superiors told him it would have been better if he had simply gone down with his ship. His actions were classified and buried for 40 years. But every time you step outside and feel the sun on your face, you owe your life to him. The man who sat in a boiling metal tube, staring the end of the world in the face, and decided to do nothing. If you have came this far, here is one last thing to know. History isn't boring, it was just presented to you in a boring way. Be honest, which part of the history felt like it's just another boring historical documentary? If it didn't felt like this, why just subscribe